Good afternoon, everyone who's chimed in on the AFOSR, Air Force Office of Scientific Research Distinguished Lecture Series. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to witness our first distinguished lecture from a very distinguished gentleman. But before we begin, I want to talk about how we came to the point to create this lecture series. And about a little bit of something about the person who basically stepped up to the plate. This is an opportunity, in my opinion, for our program officers, our international program officers, and our program coordinators to highlight and showcase the folks in research and science and engineering who they believe are at the pinnacle of their fields, who have donated and contributed so much to what we have today in terms of our science and engineering capability in the United States and beyond. And so I want to welcome you to that. I want to introduce the first person to step up and talk with me about how do we forge a distinguished lecture series and make that something that would open up to a broader audience. And I want to introduce Dr. Fred Levy, certainly a very long time colleague and very close friend. But I want to say that from 2009 until 2015, Fred was a research aerospace engineer in the Guidance, Navigation, and Controls Group of the Air Force Research Laboratory Space Vehicles Directorate. He led their research in spacecraft attitude dynamics and control. Before he left the laboratory in space vehicles, he was the technical lead for guidance, navigation, and control, and performed research in spacecraft orbit dynamics and control, and spacecraft actuator dynamics, control moment gyroscopes, steering algorithms, and systems identification. And he is certainly one of our most prolific authors, still publishing when he is able to do some research and get his hands dirty. So we really appreciate that. But he currently manages the Fundamental Research Program in Dynamics and Control, and is also the Autonomy Working Group lead at the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. He's certainly the recipient of many awards. I'm not going to go into those and embarrass him. I'd like to, but I don't think we have the time to do that. And with that, I'll introduce you to Dr. Fred Levy. Fred?
Thanks a lot, Pat. I would like to introduce, I guess, the distinguished speaker, which is why we're here today. Dr. Hartwell won the Nobel Prize in 2001 for discovering. Warren said the notes, sorry. Nobel Prize in 2001 for discovery of key regulators of the cell cycle. Before he was a professor and chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board at Canary Foundation and the Virginia G. Piper Chair of Personalized Medicine at ASU, he was the president and director of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. His education, he got his BS from Caltech and his PhD from MIT in biology. And he has many awards and honors. I could stay here for 20 minutes and go over a lot of the awards and honors, very, very prestigious awards and honors, but I want to give him some time to talk to everybody today. But some of his awards and honors are obviously the Nobel Prize in 2001. He's a member of the National Academies of Science, and he won the one of the award winners for the 21st Annual Advocacy Award, which was fairly recent. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Dr. Hartwell. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's very nice to be with you today. I have a little history with the Air Force in that, well, actually my son was in the Air Force, but also when I was a postdoctoral fellow, I had a fellowship from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And it was a prestigious fellow because I think there was only one in the U.S. and it paid very well. It was very nice. So this is my opportunity to reconnect. Thank you all. I for the last few years, decade or so, have been getting very interested in education, and particularly science education. And that's what I want to discuss with you today, sort of my thoughts. I don't feel like I have any great insights or discoveries But I think there is an opportunity to do and encourage a lot more with students than we're currently doing, in support of the next generation science standards from the National Academy of Sciences. So that's what I want to talk about. And any of you who are interested in science education and find things I have to say of interest or of controversy, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. It seems to me that science, that education in general, in most of our past has largely been about imparting information, and that our world is changing so dramatically that it really calls for an overhaul of education. And I think we're all trying to figure out how to do that and what that means. First of all, information is now widely available on the internet, so we can look things up when we need them. Secondly, computers are dramatically enhancing our brain power. We hardly think about it, but there are memories now. And thirdly, recent public responses to US politics in particular, and the COVID epidemic in general, suggests to me that most people don't understand or really care much about the truth. So these are all issues related to education. And then finally, as we all know, there's a multitude of problems facing humanity currently and in the future, such as climate change, but many, many things. In my experience with university students, today's students want to use knowledge to solve those problems. They're very interested in making the world a better place. And university graduates now need, I think, skills more than they do information. They need skills to know how to find out what is true. They need skills to distinguish those knowns that are usable from unknowns that are merely opinion. And they need to know how to create new knowledge. So how do we help students distinguish the known from the unknown and what's false? Here's where science comes in. Science has a very strict and utilitarian definition of what's known. It is measured by our ability to make predictions about the future. For example, scientists can predict eclipses with great accuracy, so that's part of our known. But no one can predict earthquakes, so that's part of our unknown. Thus, we distinguish the known from the unknown by the extent to which we can make accurate predictions about the future. I think all students, regardless of their major, will benefit in their education by learning how we actually do science in order to establish what's known. Doing science is about exploring the unknown. Yet nearly all science education is about the history of what scientists have previously discovered by doing science. Typically, it's textbook history of science. Now, it's necessary for students to learn the history of science and to know what we already know. But I think the aspect of doing science has been much neglected. For example, we encourage artists and musicians to do art and music during their education, but we rarely encourage science students to do science. The National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Medicine want to change this and have proposed the next generation science standards. I quote, just a second, it's a little noisy in here. I quote from them. The classroom now centers on the features of investigation and design instead of on the presentation of known facts. During investigation and design, students make sense of phenomena and design challenges by using observations, building on their prior knowledge and experiences, and developing and asking questions about how these phenomena work in the natural and engineered world. Thus, education should emphasize observing phenomena that we don't understand and asking questions rather than just learning previously discovered answers. But doing science is, I think, very uncomfortable for students and teachers. Students and teachers have spent years learning and teaching that the goal in the classroom is to get the right answer. Doing science requires that they become comfortable with the lack of answers. Doing science requires that they emphasize asking questions. So I've been experimenting with this question. Can naive undergraduates do authentic science? Can they observe phenomena, ask questions that have not been answered, trick nature into providing answers without a lot of prior knowledge and without a lot of expensive equipment? This is my research project. I have chosen sensory perception as a focus for doing science in the classroom. Sensory perception is rich in phenomena that are totally unknown, but are accessible to experimentation. However, sensory perception is so familiar to us that we are unaware of the unknown parts of it, that there is great mystery in our human sensory perception. A common adage is that familiarity breeds contempt. I would rephrase that to say that familiarity familiarity obscures mystery. So first we need to introduce students to the mystery of sensory perception. I try to do this with visual cognition. That is how we obtain meaning from our visual experience. Okay, now if I could have the next slide. Could we have the next slide? There we go. Okay. This is, to me, the most profound image about vision. It's a very simple drawing. And what do you see when you look at it? What you see is a cube. Now, that's interesting because this is, in fact, just a series of straight black lines on a two-dimensional piece of paper. But our minds interpret the world in 3 dimensions. In fact, all the images we see are 2-dimensional because their retina is just a single surface of cells. And yet our mind converts them to 3 dimensions for us. So that's profound in making sense out of just a series of straight lines. Also, what you notice as you look at this is that you know, one of the corners is facing out and one of the corners is facing in. I've labeled one with a red dot. So for you, that red dot is either facing out or facing in. Now, if you look at it for a while, it will switch, and the red dot will become either in the back or the front, depending on what it was before. It'll switch places. And so what our mind does is our mind does not tolerate ambiguity. Our mind looks at something, a visual image, and it makes its best guess. And we see here that it first presents it one way to us, and then it presents us the other way because it's ambiguous. It can't tell which it is. The next slide. We have the next slide. Okay, the next slide is another interesting image. This again just illustrates this issue of not tolerating ambiguity. So if you look at this image, you can see it either as two black faces facing one another or as a white vase in between. And you really can't see it both ways. You see it one way or the other. And this is again an example of how our mind interprets the visual image before it presents it to us. The big mystery of visual cognition for me that I would love students to appreciate is the question of how we manage to function successfully in such a complicated visual world that we live in with our very limited cognitive capabilities. Let me give you some examples. Our visual acuity, that is our ability to see things clearly, is limited to only about 5 degrees of our visual 180-degree field. We have the impression that we're seeing the full field clearly. And our mind is fooling us. The only reason we feel that way is because if we want to see something clearly, we move our eyes and look at it, and we put what we want to see within that 5 degrees of high acuity. In fact, our visual acuity is very, very low on the periphery. We also have very limited attention. In fact, we can attend to really only one thing at a time. And people who think they're multitasking are really trading back and forth between different tasks. That's quite a limitation. There's a lot of things going on, and yet you can only pay attention to one at a time. Thirdly is our memory. Our short-term memory is limited to 5 to 7 items for only about 1 second. So as things are appearing to us, that's our ability to comprehend what's happening. With those severe limitations, it's really quite surprising that we function at all. Students can explore and experience these limitations with very simple experiments. So how do we function? It's really quite amazing. And I think it's the nature of what I want to learn about visual cognition is what kinds of simplifications does our mind make of our visual image in order to present to us those things that are important. It's learned what's important, and it presents those things to us. Now, some of our cognitive functions, those things we do cognitively, are actually accessible to consciousness. And we can gain some insight into how we simplify visual tasks just by thinking about it. Some psychologists call that metacognition. So the next slide is one way that we do this, and that's by what I call contextualization. That is, we assess our visual field for context, and we can do this very quickly. Within a few milliseconds, 10, 20 milliseconds, we can understand the context that we're in. We rapidly sense the context of a complicated visual situation. For example, a dinner is shown here or a theater. And we then anticipate the types of visual experiences we expect in that context. We practice this skill frequently when watching movies, which may shift quickly from scene to scene. Another method of simplifying our visual experience is what I call categorization. The next slide. We categorize objects into groups like dogs or cats. Children have an amazing ability to associate new objects like these cartoons with their existing categories. It's unclear what criteria we use in creating our categories, as it is apparently very difficult to teach computers to categorize as efficiently as humans do. The next slide illustrates association. We associate things with our previous experience of them. One common method of memory enhancement is to associate new things you want to remember with a familiar story or places that you already know. Our ability to associate two things not previously connected in our thinking seems to me to really be the basis of all of our learning. The next slide illustrates prioritization. We are often very goal-oriented in our visual search for objects, food, directions, etc. Our vision is tasked by our minds with finding what our mind has prioritized, and our attention is scanning our visual field, rejecting things and selecting those that we're looking for. This ability to triage visual objects quickly is probably at the foundation of effective functioning in a complex world. And the next slide illustrates analogy. Analogy is the concept of transforming one problem to another. I use this example of the DNA molecule, where we have used the analogy of language to think about the DNA molecule. And that has led to numerous ideas about translation, punctuation, transcription, coding that have been very fruitful. On the next slide, I illustrate a very simple concept of what doing science is. We observe phenomena that we don't understand. We ask questions about those phenomena. We design experiments to try to answer those questions, and we get results. The results are frequently not exactly what we expected. And so the process becomes an iterative process where the results become the next phenomena. As the next generation science standards noted, we need to attend to phenomena, to ask questions, to do experiments, and to get results. But asking questions and designing experiments takes a lot of imagination. It's hard work. It's uncomfortable if you're not used to using your imagination. And to my thinking, imagination has been neglected in science education. By encouraging students to worry about getting the right answer, I think we give them the impression that everything is known and that it's very rigid. And this discourages imaginative thinking where your idea might be wrong. But science is just about making those imaginative leaps and taking a chance. Yeah, you might be wrong. I want to encourage students to use their imagination to explore unknown phenomena. And imagination is where art and science meet. So I think there is really something for thinking about not just STEM education, but for STEAM education, where the A is now for art, as an integrated whole. Let's consider the types of experiments that students can do. In the next slide, I illustrate that our cognition occurs in a black box, our mind. We know almost nothing about what goes on in there. In the next slide, I illustrate how students do experiments. Students' experiments involve creating and presenting visual stimuli to a subject and drawing conclusions from the subject's responses. So doing experiments involves imagining a task that you want someone to do visually and creating the appropriate visual images. That's the primary creative process in order to do an experiment. And then we conclude what goes on in the black box from the responses to the stimuli. There's a very nice software program that's freely available for doing psychology experiments that we use named PsychoPy, that was created by Jonathan Pierce at Nottingham University. The next slide. I want to illustrate the fact that experiments do not need to be complicated to be quite profound. We want students to feel comfortable trying very simple things. Testing performance on a well-designed visual task reveals what we can and what we cannot do. The results lead to new questions, new experiments, and new insights. The next slide. Take, for example, a simple performance task that is used worldwide to test visual acuity. You just look at a series of letters of different sizes on a board, and the ophthalmologist asks you which ones you can read. That very, very simple task has opened the door to many more questions, to many experiments, and revealed important facts about our vision, our eyes, and behavioral problems. For example, the vision of some people with poor acuity can be improved by lenses. And there are three major types of sight defects: nearsighted, farsighted, and astigmatic. Myopia is the most common visual defect in the world and is increasing worldwide. Easily 50% of people in the world are myopic. And it's especially high in countries where students study a lot. So it seems to be a consequence of behavior. Next slide, I want to illustrate just a couple of experiments from our class. These were student experiments. The first one here asks the subject, how many pairs of objects do you see? This is a fairly involved cognitive task, as you must scan the objects, reject those that only appear once, and count those that have appeared before during a brief visual exposure. And by timing the length of the visual exposure, you can make the experiment as hard or as easy as you want it to be. And we can look at individual differences and begin to wonder about individual cognitive variation, just like individual visual variation. The next slide illustrates an experiment on recognizing faces. And this was permitted really by the fact that there is a website that allows you to vary more than a dozen facial parameters quantitatively. so that one can test which features we are most aware of. So a student looks at this image and then, next slide, looks at this series of 4 images and is asked which of the 4 they saw before. In this particular set of 4, the distance between the eyes is varying. So this kind of experiment gets at a very profound question, which is, how do we recognize faces? By varying a lot of different parameters and doing this experiment and getting a lot of data, we can begin to see which facial features people are most sensitive to in recognizing faces. So next slide. In summary, I think there's an enormous opportunity for naive undergraduates to actually do authentic science much earlier in their careers. I think this is extremely important because if we don't do it, we're selecting people into science for the wrong reason. We're selecting for people who can get good grades on tests answering textbook questions and remembering textbook information. We want students who can think imaginatively in science. That's what they need to do. We want students who can tinker and try to make an experiment work. We need students who like to observe unknown phenomena and ask insightful questions and try to trick nature into providing answers without a lot of expensive equipment or prior knowledge, so that it's broadly available to students really at all grades. The science of our sensory perception should be a great subject for all grade levels. Indeed, most phenomena about humans are great science subjects, since we understand very little about ourselves. But in order to make this successful, we must reintroduce the mystery of what we don't know for both students and teachers. And I think this is especially important for teachers because many science teachers, most science teachers, don't really do a lot of science. They have studied only science courses, and they don't really understand this process of doing science, of observing phenomena and asking questions. So I think science teacher training is perhaps the most important thing we can do to improve science education. So the last slide, I've tried to find an answer to the question, what does this era require of us as educators? And I think through my own experience, the answer for me has become that I need to become a co-discoverer of knowledge with my students. I think I'm the best teacher and the best guide and the best inspirer when I'm trying to learn with them, rather than to be an expert imparting information. Thank you.
All right, with that, thank you very much. Well, 1 second, sorry. Thank you very much, Dr. Hartwell. With that, we'll open it up for questions. I believe we have a half an hour for questions. 1 second, I think we already got one. Okay. All right, so Dr. Hartwell, you have a question from Igor Alvarado. I could read it to you. It's Dr. Hartwell, do you think that critical thinking and relentless curiosity is what we need to teach students to challenge the status quo, as Einstein, Curie, many others did? Students have to feel challenged to find the answers to the unknown, but they do not know what they do not know. But their linear, unique method to use. That's why we applied versus basic research in the so-called Pasteur's quadrant exists. Don't we need all of them? At the end, discoveries are just sometimes made almost by chance, e.g. graphene, just using basic tools, Scotch tape, etc.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the question was there. I like everything that was said. I particularly attracted to that word curiosity. I do think that stimulating curiosity should be one of our main goals, and helping students find and explore their own curiosity is really motivating, and to put an emphasis on what students are already curious about.
So there is another question by John Lugensland from AFOSR. He thanks you for the briefing. He says there are a number of new initiatives in engineering education where students do more projects early as first years. Are these working? Do you have any suggestion on what we should do, what we should be measuring to find the best practices?
Yes, two things there. One is that there are a lot of experiments going on, materials being created to try to change the way we teach science education. And there are a lot of great things out there. I don't think they're yet widely used or deployed. And so we're in a phase of great experimentation, and we need to do more of that. The second point was, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
No, 1 second. So the second point was, are these working?
Oh, good. Yeah. So that's a question of evaluation, right? And I really like having that brought up, because I think one of the enormous problems in education is evaluation, to evaluate whether what we're doing is effective or not. And almost all of education research looks at whether the intervention in the classroom helps more students get the right answer. And if that's not what we're interested in doing, if what we're interested in doing is generating curiosity and interest and imagination, then we need to be doing our evaluations in a different way. So I think research and emphasis on evaluating curiosity, interest, and imagination are badly needed.
Thank you. We have another question by Irina Pala from AFOSR. She says an easy one. How to cultivate the curiosity, discover the new ways of teaching, inspiring this. So that's her question. How to cultivate the curiosity / discover the new ways of teaching, inspiring this.
Well, I mean, I think there are two things we can do. One is we can learn from others. And so we need to explore what other people are experimenting with and doing. But when we're in the classroom, and I've had the pleasure of being in some middle school science classrooms and providing experiments for students, we need to be scientists ourselves as instructors. We need to observe what interests students and how we can encourage that interest. And I think this is a research area.
So then,
thank you.
Sorry, they let me speak. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was going to say, how do you do it then, sir? And how do we go from you doing it and me doing it to more people doing it? Are we, sliding into like policy discussions and this? How do we do this more? How do we have better science teachers that know how to teach this way? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's the question of the day for science education is, how do we take what we're learning? And I think there are, as I say, a lot of good experiments going on out there, a lot of good materials being developed, and deploy them more broadly and train more teachers to think this way. And I don't know the answer to that. I think it is a policy question about teacher education. And I haven't had a lot of luck participating in that process of teacher education, although I've tried. So I don't know. I think there's really a lot of work to be done around questioning how we train teachers and how we can do it better. And to take examples from other countries where it is done better. Finland is often raised as a great example where teachers are very highly valued, very highly paid, very selected, and apparently do a great job.
Lucretia, did you want to ask the question or do you want me to read it out for you? Okay.
You can read it. I actually rewrote it in the second question.
Yeah, I have the second one. Okay, so Lucretia Maddox's question is, do you encourage students to minor in non-science subjects like music or design to stimulate creative questioning and stimulate creativity?
I think that's a great suggestion. I cannot say that I have, done anything productive there, but I am concerned about the fact that most majors fill up the students' time with required courses and give them very little choice of doing things that they're interested in outside of the major track. And I think that's not good education. I think that half of students' education should be of their choice of things that they're interested in outside their major.
Okay, I'll go to the next question. Christian, did you want to ask the question on the mic, or do you want me to read it for you? Okay, I guess I read it. So Christian Macedonia asks, who was your most inspiring teacher and what about them sparked your interest in science?
Oh, great question. There's a whole lot of them, but in high school, up through high school, there was only one. And I was kind of a goof off in school, and part of the Southern California Car Club group. And it was a physics teacher who got me interested in science. And somehow he took an interest in me and started challenging me with extra hard problems to take home because he thought I could do them. And that's really what hooked me in to get interested in academics and science. But then at the university, I think it had nothing to do with courses. It had almost all to do with doing research. And for some reason that I don't remember, I wanted to do research every semester, and I did at Caltech, and it was encouraged and possible there because there's so few undergraduates and compared to the number of faculty. I can't say that any of my research was terribly successful, but I learned something in the process, and perhaps the most influential person on me was Bob Edgar in the Delbruck group, who was studying how the bacteriophage T4 was put together using genetics.
Thank you.
Okay, there's another question by Doug Regan. He says he has always taught his students that the word why is the most important. How do you make this key?
Um, well, I'm sort of a biologist, and why is a difficult question to ask. It's for biology, it's a historical question that we have difficulty getting our hands around. We've been more successful in asking the question, how? How do things work?
That's fine too. The question, opening it up a little further, is in certain persons that I've had the honor to work with for different times, they have this perpetual curiosity, and it's so magnetic. And so they're always asking how and why. So it's not so much the word, but to get the attention of younger students, undergrads, for example, more than PhD students, I tell them, you got to dissect this to a question, which is going to lead to yet another set of questions, and it's perpetual. And so what I challenge them is, you want to be forever young, like Dylan says in his song. I've seen a few people who seem to be like 16-year-olds, even though they may be 70 years old. So I was wondering if you observe the same behavior, this useful, very useful way that people look at the world, the universe, the multiverse around them, and ask, why is this working this way? Or how does this work this way? I was wondering what insights you have with your own successes with students.
Yeah, I think that's what you're getting at is why I finished with the point that I feel like we need to be co-discoverers with our students, because it's the inspiration of people being interested that is really infectious. And I remember a professor I had at Caltech, James Bonner. He was a botany a scientist, but I was a physics major at first, and I took this introductory biology course just for the fun of it. And I don't remember anything in particular other than him standing down in the front of the room ranting and raving about DNA. Now this was 1957 or so it was just a few years after the structure of DNA had been discovered, and he could see how much we were going to learn from that. But it was his excitement, his infectious excitement, that turned me into a biologist.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Dr. Pat Roach. It was in the chat. It wasn't showing up in the questions because he's a panelist. Should science curricula include liberal arts, which has been lost in many colleges and universities, along with your hypothesis that we are better doing what is in the now as opposed to the past?
Yeah, absolutely. No question about that. I think if we look at science, a lot of students ask, where's the future of science? And, you know, it seems like we understand a lot about the material world, but we don't understand anything about ourselves. We don't understand anything about people. So, you know, to me, the future of science is really understanding ourselves better and other people. And the beginning of that is in the liberal arts, primarily is interested in humanity.
Very good, very good. I have a question from Alejandro Aceves. Summer internships. Oh, actually, Alejandro, did you want to use your mic, or should I'll give you a second if you want to jump in with your mic?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sure.
So thank you for the presentation. My question is about summer internships, which could be a great conduit to trigger imagination and curiosity. So the question is, how can we convince industry and national labs to go in this direction instead of embedding students in prescribed projects?
Well, it sounds like a question for the national laboratories rather than for me, but certainly a lot of universities and a lot of companies even sponsor sort of summer internships and the chance for students to do research. And these are wonderful. These are great and are often career inspiring for students. My only concern is that such a small percentage of students have an opportunity to participate in those sorts of things.
Thank you.
So there was a question that was moved to answered, but it was not answered by Stephanie Roach. The question is, do you have a lay of the land for what countries' institutions might be doing this well? This sounds like a question of pedagogy, and I'd be curious if you see any shining examples that are doing this.
I don't really. I'm not well informed about what's going on in the rest of the world.
Is there any other questions? Anybody has wants to open their mic up too? You can send a response to the chat, and Cindy, you can open your mic up if you want to ask the questions directly, or you could type them into the chat.
I believe there's 2 more questions, Dr. Levy, in the Q&A portion.
Oh, okay. It must have popped up. Give me a second. Okay. There's an anonymous attendee question. Why is education important?
Good question. Important's a funny word. What do we mean by important? What this brings to mind for me is that humans are the species that have chosen education, and particularly technology and the need for education as its thing. That's what we do, and we've learned to talk to one another in sounds and communicate with one another through symbols and learn from one another, and that has resulted in science and technology, and we're on a road that there's no turning back. That's just the path of our species. So let's follow it and see where it leads.
Okay, I have another question from Mitat Birkin at AFOSR. Actually, this might be a statement. It says, new generation values money more than science as a hobby. I mean, I guess he's asking if you agree with that statement, that the new generation values money more than science as a hobby.
The new generation values science more as a hobby.
Money more than science.
Money more than science.
Yeah.
I think that's a very individual matter, and I actually don't think so from my experience of students, but of course I very limited acquaintance, but most of the students I run into are pretty idealistic. They really want to change the world and make it a better place.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question by Igor Alvarado. It's Dr. Hartwell, what would be the right combination between active experimental hands-on learning, lab and field, and theory classroom for science students? It's a pretty loaded question.
Gee, I don't know. That sounds like a great research question for education.
Thank you. A question from Professor Wasim Haddad from Georgia Tech. Out of the following methods of science teaching, lecture, demonstration, laboratory, heuristic, observation, project, problem solving, which would you value most? All equally?
Yeah, again, I think science education research that's a question, about science education research. And I think research into science education is something that we need to do a lot more of and try to answer questions like that.
Very nice, very nice. So I don't think we have, hold on, I think one just popped up. Okay. Leslie, do you want to have your mic opened up to ask this in person, or do you want me to answer for you? Or ask it for you, sorry. Give you a couple seconds. Okay, I'll ask it for you.
Did it work?
Oh, there you go. No, there you go, Leslie.
Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Hartwell. So thank you so much for the talk. So been sitting here thinking about failure and how we can help our future scientists get comfortable with failure. It's hard to win when you play games with nature and try to trick it into telling you its secrets. And so I don't want them to give up. So how do we help them get comfortable with failing and keeping trying?
Yeah, well, I think in research and in science and in anything imaginative, there is no failure. I mean, there's just one attempt after another. And I love the attitude that is being developed about not yet. I mean, if you have a particular goal and you're trying to get there and you haven't, and you failed to achieve what you wanted to, well, you learned not to do that. So not yet, keep going. So I think we ought to eliminate failure from our vocabulary, certainly in talking about doing science.
I love that. Thank you.
Don't know if there's any more questions. Cindy, I think we're cleared out. I guess we still have time though, I think. If anybody wants to ask any more questions, please feel free to at this point.
Feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute your mic. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can see the faces. Looks like we have a shy group of folks here. Or all the wonderful questions were asked.
So
We have one hand up from Doug. Go ahead.
I always have lots of questions. Sir, first and most important, thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. Second, your themes that have been said during the talk and some of the questions are consistent with what I do and think also. I was wondering though, so I'm trying to drill deeper into perpetual curiosity, this whole sense of amazement of the universe around us, which turns into questions and more questions. For example, with my classes, especially undergraduate, and these are classes at Columbia and also MIT. I want kids to be intensely curious. And what I'd like to do in the first 3 weeks of classes to examine what other great thinkers do when they think and ask questions when arguing with each other. And an easy way I do that is I have a 3-minute video. It's embedded in an hour interview with somebody from PBS and Richard Feynman. And oh man, he just hammers this word why or how to the point where you get it. You see there's magic in continually to drill into the curiosity. Would you, reflect on what you have done in the classroom to really motivate the curiosity of a thinker to become one day a really great scientist?
Well, I can't point to any great accomplishments myself, but what you say I certainly resonate with, and it does raise a thought we haven't yet mentioned, which is the history of science. I think students can learn a lot from the past. It's not all just facts and answers. It is discovery. It is the process of discovery. And what we fail to do is to look at how discoveries were made. That is to go back in time and put ourselves in that place and say, what were people thinking at that time? Mendel is a great example where many people were trying to study heredity, but they were doing crosses between different species and between organisms that were very, very different from one another, and just looking at the progeny in the first generation. And, you know, they couldn't make any sense of it. But Mendel did something very, very different. He crossed individuals from the same species with very minor differences. He went 2 generations and he counted the results. He did several things different. And they were fundamental, and they established the whole field of genetics.
Yeah.
I think there must be examples like this throughout science. All those things that we teach students as facts, perhaps we should go back and relive with them the history. What actually happened? What were the puzzles? What were the questions? What were the arguments?
Cool. Thank you very much.
So there's a question by Haley Lane. I'll give Haley Lane a couple seconds to decide if she wants to ask that over a mic or have me read it. Okay, I guess I'll read it. So from Haley Lane, such an honor. Thank you so much for your time. What was your reaction when you found out you won the Nobel Prize? How often do you stare at the Nobel Prize? And do you think your Nobel Prize winning work was your best research to date?
So 2 things I want to respond to. One is that certainly the research we did was loads of fun. And I really, in hindsight, respect the ability to do rigorous experiments with yeast cells and to do them quickly. That is, I think when you can get rigorous answers to questions and have a short turnaround time, that's sort of the best life you can have as a scientist. And we had a lot of that fun. That was much more important in hindsight than the prize. Right now, I think the prize is important to me because it gives me the opportunity to have a position where I can explore my interests in education and have absolutely no responsibilities other than that.
That's funny. I have another question to ask that was asked to read for you. How do you foresee the role of biology will be in engineering and computer science and vice versa? Is there enough cross-pollination and transdisciplinary research?
That's a really tough question, a really interesting one, in that as technologies advance, and there is actual real evidence that technology improvement is moving exponentially. That's a scary thing. There is, to be an expert at the extreme of any field requires a tremendous amount of concentration and focused effort and dedication. And it's hard to move easily between disciplines. I don't know how we create the crosstalk that we need to between disciplines, but people who can do that should be highly valued and encouraged.
So there's, thank you so much for answering that question, Dr. Hartwell. There's another question from Colonel Avey. Colonel Avey, did you want to say this over the mic or should I read it? I'll give you a couple seconds before I start reading.
Go
ahead and jump in. Hopefully you can hear me. Dr. Hartwell, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us today and sharing this very thought-provoking presentation. My question for you was, what sort of work has been done looking at the role that demographics or personal background might play when it comes to sensory perception and how things are perceived? Thank you.
I think that's a very fundamentally interesting question, and I don't know the answer. I'm not an expert in on the literature, but it's quite clear to me from the little immersion I've done in this field is that our minds are conditioned to perceive our experience based on our past experience, our current experience based on our past experience. And there's a big filter that tries to simplify the world and interpret things based upon what we have previously experienced. We see it, for example, with languages. I mean, you learn a language, but when you're young, very easily, but it's very hard to learn a language when you're older, a separate language. So there is undoubtedly profound influence on the way people think based upon their young, especially experience. And learning more about this, I think, would be extremely fascinating.
Thank you very much. Something to think about as we put together programs for all the different people that we work with. Thank you.
Is there any more questions or anybody want to jump in on the mic? Any of the panelists possibly?
Dr. Roach has his hand up.
Okay. Dr. Roach?
Yeah, Professor Hartwell, what a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today, and really appreciate it. And thanks to Fred for making it all come to pass. I am very concerned and very worried about our future in terms of being able to have our young folks become excited about science and try to keep their interests not just through high school and you know, elementary, but certainly beyond that, and have them see this as an exciting thing that keeps them up at night and makes them want to continue to learn and learn and learn. I actually think there's some merit to your argument, and I hope to see how the Academy goes forward in actually implementing STEM education, because we're just not drawing the kids from the US into the classroom. In both places that I taught, both at Dell State University and at Vanderbilt, you saw an overwhelming number of students from other countries in engineering and physics and biology and areas. I think that's because they get it and they also see a future. I want our kids to have that same feeling going forward, and I think you know, scratching our heads, I think you have a plan at least we can probably try to execute to, which I think is really, really important. So I want to thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Fred and Cindy, and I think we're probably at the end of our time. Over.
I have one question before we wrap up, Dr. Hartwell. So I used to be very interested in massively open online courseware, the MOOCs, the free classes that I would, you know, do online. There was a whole bunch of apps. There's Coursera, EDX, iTunes University, all those things, Udemy. Nowadays, it seems like information is at our fingertips very easily, and you know, not just going to the library anymore to pick up a book and try to learn. There's whole lecture videos with homeworks and everything. You can take classes for free, even from your iPhone. So with that, do you think there's merit in having these types of classes which teach how to do science as MOOCs, as massively open online courseware, so that it can reach people fast without having to enroll in university? So they could get started in high school doing this, for example.
Yeah. I don't think, I think education may indeed be escaping the the university structure or the formal classroom structure, that so much is becoming available of high quality, that we may in fact see a future where people are educated through the media, and what that looks like, and how we make it more effective, and how we be sure that it's the right information as compared to the wrong information, and all the challenges that presents are problems for the future. But I think the brick and mortar classroom may be crumbling in response to the immediacy and universality, availability of things on the internet.
Very, very cool. Very cool. Thank you for your answer. I don't think we have any more questions left. So Dr. Hartwell, if you have any remarks, closing remarks before we wrap up.
Just thank you for the opportunity to visit with you. I hope I hear from some of you regarding potential ideas or opportunities or whatever.
Well, we thank you so much for honoring us with this talk, and we hope to see some of the stuff you're talking about implemented in the future, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye all.
Thank you, Kayla.